Okay, this is the third of our mini lectures as we've come back from spring break. And again, a very quick video post here. What I want to do is get at this idea in terms of population of mortality and morbidity. That is deaths and disease. And again, I'm not going to cover this a lot, but from a geographer's standpoint, what we're always interested in is when we look at population, where are people dying, the causes of that death, and then how that changes through time and space. And so, of course, everybody dies. That's a simple thing. And when we look at it, the first way that we understand that is through this idea of crude death rates. We talked about this earlier in the semester, but I'm kind of returning to it. So within this video, make sure that you understand crude death rate. We're going to look at life expectancy and how that changes. And then we're going to look at these DALYs again. This is a measure of the morbidity. So if you think about it, crude death rates and life expectancy are ways of understanding mortality. DALYs are a way of understanding morbidity or disease. So let's take a look. Crude death rate, again, our simplest measure, CDR, deaths per 1,000. And if we look at this, if we go back in time to 1950, one of the things that we can say is that death rates were really quite high. And when you see 4% at the bottom here, what that really is 40 per thousand. Remember that that's a per mil, so convert it to percent. But what we see is that much of South Asia, the Middle East, and virtually all of the continent of Africa had relatively high crude death rates. North America and Europe significantly lower. If we move through time, though, to today, what we notice is that crude death rates have dropped throughout the world. There's really a significant drop in crude death rates and more or less kind of a uniformity of it across space. Now, certainly there's somewhat higher rates in parts of sub-Saharan Africa and in the Middle East. And in fact, Russia has actually increased its crude death rate. But again, that's a very simple measure, simply people dying. Now we can flip this around then and look at life expectancy. In other words, how long do you expect to live? And a century ago, what we would have said is that throughout much of the world where we had data, and everything in gray here we simply had no data for, much of the world had a life expectancy that was extremely short. In most cases, less than or near 30 to 40 years. And it was only in North America and parts of Europe that we began to see even moderately long lifespans, that is to 60 years. Now, take this forward a century, and the world has changed radically. Life expectancies have soared. In fact, nowhere in the world today do we have life expectancies under 50 years. And so, again, we have radically changed mortality across the globe. Now, that in part has dealt or deals with the issue of morbidity. And remember that morbidity, what we're talking about is disease and various forms of things that cause illness or death. And so what we're going to use here for morbidity is the disability adjusted life year. And this simply means the number of years lost in terms of their life expectancy, early death, or the number of years lived with a disability. So YLD, or years lived with disability, versus years of life lost. So we can imagine years lived with disability might be years lived with diabetes, for example, or with an infectious disease that prevented you from meaningfully working. It also means the number of years lost, years of life lost, from the average life expectancy in that country. And so if we look at DALYs, one of the things that we can see is that while people may live longer in many of these countries, some of those years are not lived in a quality of life that isn't affected by disease or some other burden. So if we look at this total DALYs, overall, the total DALYs, in other words, years lived or lost with the burden of disease, it is still highest in sub-Saharan Africa, although you'll notice it's also very high here in Afghanistan and moderately high in some parts of Southeast Asia. You also notice, though, that the United States and Mexico have a higher DALY rate than does much of Europe. And so that's an interesting kind of way of looking at this. Now, if we break DALYs apart, what are the causes? Well, one thing that we can say are that communicable diseases, those are diseases that are infectious, those that we communicate, or that are nutritional and maternal neonatal, that is related to childbirth and early childhood, that we can see that these are extremely high. This is one of the major causes in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, that in these areas it is the diseases that are communicable, diseases that are transmittable, that cause much of the harm in life, the reduction of the quality of life. Now, contrast that with non-communicable diseases. Now, it's still high throughout the African continent, but you'll notice that throughout much of Eastern Europe and into South Asia, these non-communicable diseases are the ones that are also very significant. And these include such things as cancers, heart disease, respiratory diseases, cardiovascular diseases. Many of these are, if you will, lifestyle diseases. And again, they are much more broadly present. Now, the last grouping of causes are what we call self-injurious activities or injuries. And what is interesting about these is that these tend to be most prevalent in Europe and in North America, but also in China, Japan, and in Southeast Asia. And what's interesting about these is that one of the components of these are self-harm and violence. Now, self-harm and violence also refer to those things that affect people in terms of the use of controlled substances and addiction. And so some of these things are much more prevalent in Western Europe and in the United States. So we can't really look at DALYs as a single thing, but we know that they have different characteristics in terms of their geographic distribution. Okay, in our next video, we'll be talking about the demographic transition. We'll see you then.